Recording for this meeting has begun.
Again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Part 1, HUD-VASH, an overview. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. We have with us today Jesse Vazano. Jesse serves as the National Director of Housing and Urban Development, Veteran Affairs, Supportive Housing, or HUD-VASH, for the Veterans Health Administration. Prior to working with HUD-VASH, Jesse served as the Network Homeless Coordinator for the VA Capital Health Care Network and was responsible for operational oversight of homeless services for VA medical centers in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Martinsburg, West Virginia. Jesse also served as the Healthcare for Homeless Veterans Coordinator and Grant and Per Diem Liaison at the Bedford, Massachusetts, and White River Junction, Vermont VA Medical Centers. So with that said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jesse.
Great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Shantira said, my name is Jesse Vazano, and I'm the National Director of the HUD-VASH program for the VA. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of our program, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you type into the chat box. And with that, I think I'll just jump in and get started. So the HUD-VASH program is a collaborative program with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who provides Housing Choice Vouchers, commonly referred to as Section 8 vouchers, that are allocated to participating housing authorities to assist with rental payments. And then the VA provides the clinical case management and supportive services to assist homeless veterans to obtain and sustain permanent housing, while also assisting those same veterans with accessing treatment and other supportive services to help them promote their quality of life and increase their sense of independence and self-sufficiency. So the program started, actually it started 26 years ago, but is recognized for the program that started expanding in 2008. And it's a strong partnership between two federal agencies. It's been referred to as a gold standard because of the collaboration between the two agencies working together towards the common goal of ending veteran homelessness. So the HUD-VASH program as a whole operates on the principles of Housing First, which is a clinical evidence-based practice that really is about low barrier admission, high barrier exit. It's about taking individuals directly from the streets and putting them into permanent housing while providing wraparound care and services to help them maintain their housing. There are no prerequisites, so there's no requirement of clean time or sobriety or time in a shelter. It's working with taking the most vulnerable and the most complex and getting them into permanent housing. Research has shown over and over again that just the stabilization of housing can help reduce some of the symptoms and sense of crisis that people that are on the streets and are homeless may be working with on a daily basis. The HUD-VASH program as a whole targets and prioritizes the chronically homeless and the most vulnerable homeless veterans first. So we are not a waitlist-oriented program. We are a needs-based program. So we are looking to work with those veterans that have been homeless the longest and have the most complex and vulnerable clinical profiles. Our primary goal is to move veterans and their families out of homelessness into permanent supportive housing while promoting that veteran's sense of recovery and independence and integration into their community. So overall, we want to help end veterans' homelessness by getting veterans off the street and helping them become productive members of their community again. So I just mentioned Housing First, and I thought it would be helpful if I went through the 8 basic principles of Housing First that the HUD-VASH program operates on. These are not unique to HUD-VASH. Housing First is an internationally recognized model of care and is incorporated in many housing programs across the country and as well as other countries. So the first is that housing is a basic human right. It's something that we all have the right to have. It's something that we should all be able to access. The second is respect, warmth, and compassion for all clients, and I think of this as the golden rule, treating others as you would like to be treated, and remembering that while the person that you're working with or that's sitting across from you may not look like you, may have different hardships than you, they still deserve our respect and compassion. The third is a commitment to working with clients for as long as they need. So HUD-VASH is a permanent supportive housing program, and in this principle, I think the permanent is the key word there. A veteran can be in the HUD-VASH program for as long as he or she thinks that they need it. We have veterans that have been in the program since 2008. We have veterans that are in the program for a shorter period of time. But it's about our clinical team making the commitment to working with the veteran for as long as he or she needs. Part of what we may be doing with that veteran clinically over time is lessening the amount of interaction that we have with them as they gain more independence, and helping that veteran really test their self-sufficiency so that they can continue to move forward and maybe not need the clinical services anymore. Next is scattered site housing or independent apartments. So I will say that I'm of two minds on this, and I see this really as housing choice. So we have project-based HUD-VASH and for about 8% of our HUD-VASH vouchers, but the majority of our HUD-VASH vouchers are scattered site independent apartments, and that's about veteran choice and housing choice. If we only offered one type of housing, then we wouldn't be allowing choice or independence. So really this is about letting an individual choose what type of housing they want. Ideally, it's safe, sanitary, it's affordable, and as I'm sure many of you know, that's more difficult depending on which community you're in and the cost of living. But that's something that we strive for. Next is the separation of housing and services. So this is something that is a little bit different about HUD-VASH, is a little bit different about Housing First. A lot of programs that offer multiple services tie them together. So if you're providing transitional housing, you can only get the clinical care of transitional housing while you're in that transitional housing. And with this, within HUD-VASH and with the principles of Housing First, and the separation of housing and services is really about that we want the clinical and the case management to come from the VA staff, and we want the housing to be coming from the housing authority and the landlord. So we want the landlord to make sure that they're enforcing the lease and the tenants of the lease, and clinically we'll be working with that veteran to help him or her understand what the potential consequences are of not following the tenants of the lease, but that it's not our job to enforce the lease. And then if a veteran loses their housing for some reason, that doesn't mean that they lose their case management team. The case management team would work with the veteran to help him or her understand what happened and why they lost their housing and what would help them be a better tenant in the future so that we can help them get rehoused. Next is consumer choice and self-determination, which you've already heard me talk about several times. So it's recognizing veteran choice or participant choice about what they want and what they need, and then helping them strive for self-determination. So it's making that person an active part of the decision-making process. Housing First is also built on a recovery orientation. So while it doesn't have prerequisites of housing, of sobriety or clean time, we recognize that by helping individuals get into housing that we're going to help them work towards recovery from being homelessness and those barriers or obstacles that may have come into their lives that led to homelessness. And then the last principle, but certainly not the least, is a harm reduction principle. So this means, again, that recognizing that while we don't require sobriety or abstinence, that may ultimately be someone's goal. They may not be able to accomplish that overnight. So working with them from a harm reduction approach. And for other individuals in the program, their goal may not be to be clean and sober if they are struggling with addiction. Their goal may be to put themselves at a lesser risk for an overdose. So working with them around opportunities that they can put themselves in that would help them reduce negative outcomes or put them at risk. So those are the 8 principles of Housing First. And I will say it's been a very big cultural change for the VA to be able to implement Housing First. And even though we're about 6.5 years into this, transformation and change in terms of implementing Housing First as the model of care for HUD-VASH. I think it's a slow ship to turn, and we're still working on it. So I think some things were much easier to implement, and there's others that we still have lots of conversation about how to implement locally. So with that, I just want to talk about a little bit about the clinical approach to HUD-VASH. So we practice based on the use of evidence-based clinical models, the first of which I just talked about, which is Housing First. The second is that case management participation is required in HUD-VASH. Oftentimes people hear Housing First and they think housing only, or they hear those 8 principles and they think that case management is optional. It is not optional, but the case management may look different for each individual in the program, because what one person's willing to do or is able to do is different from what someone else is willing to do or able to do. So it's a very individualized approach, with the goal of the clinical team being that over time they will be able to engage the veteran at the level that is needed and can be accepted by the veteran to best meet his or her needs. Our staff overall, we have about 4,000 staff in the HUD-VASH program, are overwhelmingly social workers, independently licensed, but we also have nurses, peer support specialists, housing specialists, employment specialists, recreational therapists. So our expectation is that everyone in our program is working to the highest level of their licensures and their competencies. And with that, their clinical engagement is going to depend on their clinical training. So a social worker is going to engage a veteran differently than a peer support specialist. But also the engagement is going to look different based on the veteran's needs. So if a veteran is needing or seeking treatment for an abscess on their foot, the engagement model is going to look very different than a veteran who needs to keep his or her utilities on this month. And then also it's going to be around what the veteran's goals are. Short-term and long-term, ideally we're looking at just a few goals at a time that we're working on. But if a veteran comes in with the goal of home ownership, and that home ownership is 50 acres of undeveloped land that they're going to build a house on, which is a great goal to be striving for, we're going to work with them to break it down to what we can be working on now to help them ultimately get to that really big goal. And then if there's things that are going on that are threats to the veteran's housing or stability overall, we also want to make sure that our engagement is appropriate for that. So, if a veteran is actively using substances in their home, that's probably a lease violation, so we're going to make sure that we're engaging them around that they know what's going on. If a veteran isn't paying his or her rent on time or isn't paying his or her utilities, that could potentially lead to them losing their housing. So we want to make sure that the engagement is about the decisions that are being made and why those decisions are being made. And then overall, what's going on with their stability? How can we help that veteran maintain their stability in their home, in their community, and in their movement forward to becoming fully independent again? So just wanted to give a little bit of our program information. HUD-VASH is recognized as a large contributor to an almost 50% drop in veteran homelessness since 2010. Our program overall has had ongoing bipartisan support. It's a program that I think everybody can get behind. We're talking about getting veterans off the street and into housing. So we've seen that ongoing support help expand the program. Since 2008, we've had approximately 93,000 HUD-VASH vouchers funded by Congress. The vouchers are funded under HUD's budget, and then the clinical care and the supportive services are funded under VA's budget. So those 93,000 vouchers are funded as part of HUD's budget, and we're currently working with HUD to allocate another 5,000 vouchers by the end of this fiscal year, which for those of you that follow the federal fiscal year, that would be the end of this month. So we would have about 98,000 vouchers nationally funded by Congress, which makes us one of the largest permanent supportive housing programs in the country. But again, I think it really speaks to the support and need of the program. So we currently have about 4,000 staff working in HUD-VASH. This doesn't include contracted staff. We do fund some contracted staff. However, because we fund the contract as a lump amount, we don't track that staff individually. With the additional 5,000 vouchers that we'll be adding this fiscal year, or hopefully. We anticipate that we'll add up to about 200 staff to support those new vouchers. So it's a large program, but again, we've seen the successes that it has brought to the goal of ending veteran homelessness nationally. So who is eligible for HUD-VASH? Very simple, basic eligibility is that you have to be a veteran who is homeless. You have to demonstrate a need for case management and supportive services to maintain permanent housing. You have to be eligible for VA care and services. And then the Housing Authority is responsible for two different pieces of eligibility. The first is making sure that the veteran is not a lifetime registered sexual offender and that the veteran is not over the income limits. The sexual offender registration, there's actually no national registration, so the Housing Authority does its own verification, and what may be a lifetime registration in North Carolina may not be a lifetime registration in Texas. So there's a lot of intricacies, and that's why that's something that the housing authorities have done for a long time, and that's part of their responsibility. And the second piece about the income limits, again, those income limits are going to vary based on where the voucher is being issued from and where that housing authority has jurisdiction. So, for example, a veteran who is homeless and getting a VA service-connected benefit at 100% would be over income in Western Massachusetts and not be eligible for the program. But if that same veteran presented in Boston, he or she would be under the income limit because of the difference in the cost of living between the two communities. So again, it's important that we let the housing authorities verify that. There also may be income exclusions that the housing authority can apply that the medical center staff would not know about. And then that second eligibility item, the demonstrating the need for case management and supportive services, is about the importance that HUD-VASH is not a housing-only program. We are a supportive housing program, so we want to make sure that the veterans that are coming in are vulnerable but also need those supports to help them maintain housing successfully. As I said earlier, we are not a first-come, first-served program. We're not a waitlist program. We serve the veterans that have the greatest needs first, so targeting, again, those chronically homeless veterans, highly vulnerable veterans, with the expectation that the medical center is working together with its homeless continuum of care providers to identify those veterans with the greatest need and first priorities. So how is homelessness defined for the HUD-VASH program? We follow the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, so we follow the federal definition of homelessness, where it means that an individual lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Their primary residence is that of a public or private place not designated for or ordinarily used as a sleeping accommodation regularly by humans. So this could be someone living in their car, it could be someone living on the streets, it could be someone living in an abandoned building, or they may be living in a supervised public or privately operated shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangements. So again, these may be shelters that are operated by the religious community, they may be shelters that are operated by the city or the county, and then also individuals who are residing in a shelter or place not meant for human habitation and are exiting an institution where they temporarily resided. So individuals that were homeless prior to being institutionalized may be at risk. Individuals who are at imminent risk, which is defined as 14 days from eviction with nowhere else to go. And then those who are fleeing domestic violence are all potentially eligible for fitting the category of homelessness for the HUD-VASH program. So if you're looking to refer a veteran, if you have a veteran in your community who you think would be appropriate for the HUD-VASH program, we strive with our community partners, with our continuums of care, to have a no wrong door approach so that no matter where a veteran is identified, whether it's at a VA medical center, if it's at a community provider, wherever it may be, that veteran would be assessed and referred to the most appropriate program. HUD-VASH may or may not be the most appropriate program. And that process of a no wrong door approach that we talk about is also part of what we call a coordinated entry system. So working with our local HUD continuums of care, having a process where we are identifying and prioritizing any homeless individual that's coming in to make sure that they're getting attached or referred to the most appropriate program and service. I don't know anybody that's homeless that's going to say, I want to go to a shelter or I want to go to transitional housing. Most people are going to want permanent housing, but based on the way that all of the different programs within the continuum of services are set up, not every person is going to be eligible for permanent housing or considered the most in need for permanent housing. Some individuals may be able to go to transitional housing, get some short-term services, get some training, be able to return to work, and move out independently within the time frame of transitional housing. So it's about that coordinated entry process is really about identifying, being able to connect with the referrals and be able to make sure that people are connected to those services that are most appropriate. Overall, we work with our local HUD continuums of care, our community partners, and other community-based stakeholders. So there's no limit on who we can be working with to help identify veterans and refer veterans. Veterans can also self-refer. If you have a veteran come in your door or you know of a veteran that needs help, you can always call our National Homeless Call Center. That's the 1-877-48-VET number that's on this slide. That will generate, depending on where that veteran is, it will generate a referral to the closest medical center for that medical center to follow up with the veteran and, again, help and assist him or her with accessing the most appropriate programs. Referrals also come from other VA homeless programs, so they may come from our shelter contracts. They may come from our transitional housing program called Grant and Per Diem. They may come from our homeless domiciliary. They may come from our rapid rehousing program referred to as supportive services for veteran families. And then any other community or VA-based programs. So we have satellite clinics that are called community-based outpatient centers. And then we also have vet centers, which are mental health providers for veterans, primarily who have served in combat, that are not part of the VA system but have access to the VA system. So referrals could also come from our other VA partners. So I see a question that came up in the chat box that says based vouchers. I think I'm missing part of it. Give me 1 second. How is the award of project-based vouchers determined? Is there a minimum or maximum of units awarded? So project-based vouchers are awarded through the housing authorities, and there is an overall cap on the percentage of project-based vouchers that can be awarded or that a housing authority can have in their overall portfolio. They can project-based all of their HUD-VASH vouchers. Historically, VA and HUD used to set aside and competitively award project-based vouchers. We have stopped doing that due to the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, or HOPMA Act, that HUD has enacted that allows the housing authorities to convert any tenant-based vouchers to project-based vouchers. So that may be a more difficult question than I think you were asking, but it's really about working with your housing authority and your medical center if there's a need for project basing, and we do recognize that project basing is a huge benefit to the HUD-VASH program, particularly in communities that have limited housing stock or have high cost of living. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving forward here. So with the targeted populations, I've talked a little bit about who we target. I've referred to them as chronic. I've referred to them as the most vulnerable. So I do just want to cover the populations that we do target overall for HUD-VASH because, as I said, we are not a first-come, first-served program. So the first targeted population are the chronically homeless individuals and veterans. So those, again, are following the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act definition. Those are individuals who are living in places not meant for human habitation, in a safe haven, or in an emergency shelter. They have a disability, and I just want to make sure the disability here is really, it doesn't have to be a Social Security disability determination, but they have a disability. They have some type of barrier that leads them to need supportive services and case management to help them maintain housing. And then they've been continuously homeless for at least 12 months or on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, totaling 12 months. Excuse me. So that chronically homeless definition is a little bit complex, but it's something to be aware of. Again, the program overall is going to prioritize those veterans that have been homeless the longest first, because usually those are veterans that haven't been successful in more traditional programs or more linear models of shelter to transitional housing to permanent housing. So this is a model that recognizes that. And then we target, as I've said, the most vulnerable. So those that are demonstrating the most need or vulnerability based on clinical or psychosocial circumstances. Again, usually the most vulnerable have been homeless for a long time, but they may be individuals that have had some type of health crisis. It could be a physical health crisis. It could be a mental health crisis that increases their vulnerability and their need to get off the streets more quickly. We do follow HUD's prioritization for non-chronically homeless veterans. That's something that helps us work with our continuums of care. They follow the same prioritization, so it helps for some continuity between the two. We have special populations that we also target and prioritize: female veterans, veterans with children, veterans from our current conflicts, which are Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation New Dawn, veterans that are aging, so being on the streets, your chronological and your biological age don't necessarily match up anymore. So we are also looking at those veterans who are older and have more problems. And then those with debilitating clinical conditions. If you look at the HUD prioritization, I would say that you would be hard-pressed to fit a special population into any, you would not be hard-pressed to fit one of our special populations into any of those non-chronic priority groups. But if for some reason they don't, we have, within VA, we have said if you have someone who's homeless that fits a special population group and doesn't fit any of these other prioritization groups, that they're still on the list and still eligible. And then when we're looking at those non-chronic homeless veterans, we do prioritize those, as I said. So this is, the HUD prioritization is really around periods of time homeless and severity of need. So after chronic homeless, they're going to look at disability with long periods of episodic homelessness and severe service needs, and then disabled with severe service needs, and then disabled coming from places not meant for human habitation without severe service needs, and then those with disabilities coming from transitional housing. So it lessens somewhat, but it encompasses most of our homeless populations in some way. And then the VA priority populations, which I just reviewed, would fall below that. Again, only if that person or individual did not fit into any of those 4 HUD prioritization groups. So how do we allocate our HUD-VASH vouchers? Overall, this is something that we work on with HUD, because ultimately HUD is the one who's allocating the vouchers. Remember, the funding for the vouchers goes to HUD, and then HUD issues the funding to the public housing authorities. So we do this in collaboration. The VA has a gap analysis tool that integrates data from VA and HUD and has feedback from community partners in it. It also uses data from the homeless point in time, or PIT count, and it identifies gaps across permanent housing options for veterans experiencing chronic homelessness, rapid rehousing, and other residential programming. And other residential programming could be things like homeless domiciliary stay. It could be transitional housing. It could be within the VA, we have healthcare for homeless veterans, contract emergency residential services. So we're looking at those different things, and we're looking at where there's gaps. And then the medical centers and the housing authorities have to collaborate to provide a registration of interest letter of support. So a housing authority is ultimately who's going to request and apply for the HUD-VASH vouchers, but they can only do that if they have a letter of support from their medical center. So overall, it's a collaborative process on many levels. So the VA and HUD on a high level are looking at working together and using their analysis to determine where there's relative need for vouchers. And then on a more local level, medical centers and housing authorities are collaborating to talk about, do we still need, vouchers in this community, or do we need less vouchers than we thought we needed 6 months ago? So again, looking at all of that. And during those conversations, it's also a really good idea to be talking with your community partners, right? Because the housing authority and the medical center could be looking at one piece, but the continuum of care, your homeless community providers could be seeing a whole other picture that you're not even aware of that's going to point to additional need, or maybe there's a new building that's being built that's going to house 50 homeless veterans not through VA programs, and that's really going to reduce the need overall for a HUD-VASH. So it's important that you bring in your partners when you're talking about that, and we always encourage that collaboration and communication to be ongoing. Once we actually start getting into the negotiation around vouchers, a lot of that information is embargoed and we're not able to talk about it anymore. So it's important that we're talking about where that need is and where it exists. Most medical centers are going to serve multiple counties. I'm located in the state of Vermont. Our medical center serves the entire state and 3/4 of New Hampshire. So we want to have that conversation ongoing about where the needs are. Are the needs closer to Burlington or Montpelier where we have cities, or are they more spread out around the state where we have more rural settings? So thinking about that as well. So overall, what are the services in case management that we're providing? Again, so I talked about the vouchers being part of HUD's budget and the staff being part of VA's budget. So the supportive services in case management are the responsibility of the VA medical centers, which are part of the Veterans Health Administration. We have started recently really encouraging and helping to incorporate a team approach to case management, recognizing that as we add more multidisciplinary staff, as we move away from only having social workers in the HUD-VASH program and adding in peer support specialists and nurses and recreational therapists and occupational therapists, employment specialists and housing specialists, that can help really meet the need of a veteran in a different way. So what we are striving for are multidisciplinary teams and HUD-VASH programs that are working together and that are sharing their caseload. So nobody has singular ownership over a veteran or says, this is my veteran and I'm the only one that can work with him. But that the social worker and a peer support specialist and an addiction specialist may be working together to help a veteran who's really struggling and saying that they want to get into treatment and, wants to stop using addictive substance. So they're working together jointly to help meet that veteran's needs, and they're sharing that work together. And the peer support specialist may be working with that veteran and going to an NA meeting with that veteran or helping that veteran get to a community meeting somewhere. The social worker may be working on a referral or identifying some resources or helping them look at what's in their home that may be a trigger for them. And the addiction specialist may be working with the substance abuse program locally, whether it's in the community or at the medical center, and helping that veteran get to appointments so that they can get into treatment. And that's what we mean by shared caseloads, everybody working together to meet the needs of that veteran. There may be different times that different staff are in the driver's seat for that veteran, and again, that's going to be based on a veteran's needs and wants. A veteran may be more comfortable talking to a peer specialist if they've been clean for 6 months and they have a drink. And they may not be comfortable right away saying to their substance use disorder specialist that they relapsed over the weekend and they drank. But they might feel more comfortable talking to the peer support specialist. So it's important in that team approach that the peer support specialist can have that conversation with the veteran, can also help the veteran understand that, one, they're not going to necessarily lose their housing over it. It may be a violation of their lease depending on what type of housing they're in, but that they're not going to necessarily lose their housing over it. But two, that there's services and support available, and that's part of what the team is there for. So again, that goes back to that separation of housing and services that we talked about earlier. Our services in case management are really going to start from the time a veteran's identified, assessed, and admitted to the HUD-VASH program, is going to follow through to the lease-up process, and then be ongoing into housing. The intensity of case management, as I said earlier, is going to vary based on the needs and wants of the veteran. Clinically, we may see that veteran as being an intensive needs veteran, maybe needing to be seen multiple times in a week or have multiple contacts in a week, and that veteran may not be willing to do that. That doesn't mean that we don't work with that veteran. It means that we try to find that balance and use some progressive skills to help engage that veteran and build trust. Overall, we're working to assist that veteran obtain and sustain housing. We're going to help them engage in treatment as appropriate and as they want. We're also going to help them integrate into their community and increase their quality of life. So if somebody's homeless and they're on the streets, a lot of their day is spent in crisis, and they know that they need to be somewhere by a certain time to get a meal. Maybe they need to be somewhere by a certain time to get a shower, but they need to be in line at the shelter by a certain time to make sure they get a bed. When we move someone into housing, a lot of those crises alleviate, but there's other things that arise. There's loneliness. There's a sense of having to learn new skills, right? Maybe somebody hasn't cooked for themselves in 20 years. Maybe somebody hasn't been to the grocery store. So looking at that, but also finding new outlets for socialization is really critical, combating that loneliness that can come from leaving peers and social groups that you've been a part of and moving into housing. So I've talked about this a little bit. I've alluded to it a little bit, but really what does it mean when we talk about separation of housing and services? So it means that the case management and the tenants of the lease are separate. So we want landlords to enforce the lease as they would for any other tenant or renter. We want, if they provide written warnings on the third day of the month when someone hasn't paid their rent, we want the veterans in HUD-VASH to get that written warning. If I call up my landlord or my property manager and I complain about the person that's blasting their radio at 2 in the morning, and that means the property manager is going to have a conversation with the neighbor that does that, we want them to do that for HUD-VASH. Because we want the veterans who are being housed with HUD-VASH vouchers to be treated just like any other veteran or any other renter in that building. That doesn't mean that the clinical staff, that the HUD-VASH team isn't going to advocate for that veteran, but we're also going to build a relationship with the veteran to help the veteran understand what his or her rights are and how he or she can advocate for herself or himself, but also to help the landlord understand what the VA case management can and can't do, right? So we can help support the tenants of the lease. We can help the veteran understand that they're living in a unit that has that's smoke-free, meaning that nobody can smoke in the apartment, and that if they are smoking in the apartment, they're violating their lease and what the potential consequences are. We're also going to progressively engage veterans, again, to try to get them to that level of clinical care that we think that they need, but to also help them be more successful in their housing. And then we want to help veterans understand how their actions may result in lease violations, like I said. So while we want the landlord to enforce the lease, and clinically we're not going to enforce the lease, we want to help make sure that the veteran understands any possible repercussions of violating that lease to help them maintain their housing. It's also really important, we have found over time, to help veterans find things that will root them down in their housing. We're talking about a population that has been homeless before. The threat of being homeless may not be terrifying to them. It may not be something that is a game changer for them necessarily. But if they're able to start making their house into a home and have things that they really want to hold on to and that are important to them, it can also help connect that veteran to that unit and help them make changes so that they can be a good tenant and continue to go forward. So there was a question earlier that was asked about project-based and tenant-based vouchers, so let me just step back and speak to these two types of vouchers. Tenant-based vouchers are Housing Choice Vouchers, or HCV, and the Housing Choice Program allows for low-income families to choose and lease their housing, again, safe, decent, and affordable privately owned rental housing. So it could be if you live in an apartment building, maybe some of your neighbors have Housing Choice Vouchers. You don't know. But the tenant-based vouchers are commonly referred to as Section 8. And project-based vouchers are similar. They're a component of the Housing Authority's housing support program, but it's where the Housing Authority enters into a contract with a property owner for a specified number of units for a specified term. So the assistance is tied to the rental unit, not the individual vouchers. So for example, you might have 5 project-based units in one building, or you might have 5 project-based buildings spread out across 5 buildings. But what it does is it provides dedicated housing stock. So it's a guarantee of housing specifically for the HUD-VASH program. So the tenant-based program, which is what the majority of HUD-VASH vouchers are so we have about 85,600 HUD-VASH vouchers that are tenant-based, so it's about 8% overall. Oops, I missed a typo there. It allows veterans more choice in where they live. They can take their voucher, and there's certain parameters in terms of how much the voucher will cover in rent, the size of the unit that the voucher will support, depending on whether it's an individual veteran or a veteran with 2 children or a veteran that has a reasonable accommodation. So it allows the veteran to locate housing that would meet their needs and their wants, ideally. And I say ideally just because I know that the fair market rate of a housing voucher may not meet the competitive rate of a rental community, and so sometimes there have to be compromises. And the voucher moves with the veteran. So if the veteran is looking to, after 2 years of being in their housing, they built up a better rental history and they want to move to a nicer community or a better apartment, and they can do that with their voucher. They can do that if it's a tenant-based voucher. So it does support more choice in housing. And as I said, the value is based on the fair market rate. And the rental calculation for HUD-VASH vouchers is the same as it is under the regular Housing Choice Voucher program. So HUD-VASH rental calculations are the same as they are for any other Section 8 program. So project-based vouchers are about, like I said, about 8% of our total HUD-VASH allocation, and it allows for a greater concentration of services to be provided to veterans. So what we are finding in some of our project-based buildings are when they are being renovated or constructed, there's really great communication between the medical center, the housing authority, and the developer, and there's some dedicated space for the VA staff to be on site. So maybe instead of reporting to the medical center, they're reporting to that building, and they're being, the team is housed there. So maybe there's 50 veterans in that building, and there's a team of 3 staff that are there 40 hours a week, and maybe there's other staff that come in throughout the week to provide additional services. It can help create veteran communities, which can also help create support systems and positive networking. And we find that some veterans really thrive on this, and other veterans say that that's not what they want. So that's why it's important that we offer both project-based and tenant-based, and it allows for some veteran choice in selecting project-basing. We have some project-based units that are clean and sober housing. And that meets the needs of some veterans. We have some project-based housing that are mixed in with regular community-based housing, and we have some that are just veteran-specific. So as I've said throughout this presentation, it adds dedicated housing stock for veterans. It's a subsidy that's attached to the unit and is not transferable. So again, it's that commitment of housing. And similar to the tenant-based voucher, the value is based on the fair market rate, and the rental calculation is the same as under the regular Housing Choice Voucher program. So if you think about those 8 principles of housing first that I talked about at the beginning, one of them was scattered site independent apartments. So I've talked about project basing, which may not sound like it's supporting that independence, but part of what we find is that there has to be veteran choice. You can't say to a veteran that he or she has to go into project-based housing. Oftentimes with project-based housing, as I said, there may be a concentration of services, so maybe a veteran who hasn't done well in tenant-based housing may be willing to explore project-based housing, or it may go the other way. And not all of our HUD-VASH programs have project-based housing. As I said, some veterans prefer to live with other veterans. They find some of those shared experiences to be really beneficial to them. And then the 2 types of vouchers overall support the principle of housing choice because no veteran is forced to utilize one type over the other. And then our project-based vouchers have at times been used to help us meet higher need veterans, so veterans that have that are aging in place. They don't need nursing home level of care, but they need some additional services. So being able to have an occupational therapist that can come and see 4 or 5 or 10 veterans at once because they're all co-located may be beneficial, or may be helping with providing a group or additional services on site. Project basing has also been helpful with meeting the needs of veterans with physical and mental health disabilities as well. So I wanted to just touch on those partnerships and roles. So the best possible outcome is right here in the center where the veteran, the landlord, and the case manager are all working together and everybody recognizes each person's roles and responsibilities. I think what oftentimes probably happens is the case manager and the veteran are working together and the case manager and the landlord are working together, but maybe the veteran and the landlord aren't necessarily communicating. And one of our goals is for veterans to become self-sufficient, so we do want them to learn to become their own best advocates and be able to be comfortable calling their landlord or the property manager to say that their sink is leaking and it needs to be fixed, or that there's water damage from the apartment above, or that somebody's screaming at 2 in the morning every morning and it's disturbing their sleep. So what's the veteran's responsibility and role? So with the support of the case management team, we want the veteran to be able to find housing. We want them to pay their rent and their utilities on time, and we want them to be a good tenant. This is all part of things that are going to happen in clinical case management as well. And again, that ties back to the clinical team helping the veteran understand their roles and responsibilities, but also the consequences of not being following their tenancy. The veteran is expected to participate in case management. It is housing first. It is not housing only. And again, that will vary based on the needs and wants of the veteran. It will be an individualized approach. A veteran who's been very stable and has been in the program for 2 or 3 years is probably going to have less case management than somebody that's just coming in that's more disorganized, needs some more support and help getting themselves through the day in terms of meeting their goals for the day. And then we're going to help the veteran comply with their housing authority requirements. So what's the case management team's role? We wanted to make sure that the case management is identifying, assisting, and admitting veterans appropriately to the program so that they're targeting the correct population and prioritizing it appropriately, that they're providing the appropriate level of care and services based on acuity, that they're facilitating and providing access to the appropriate treatment and service case management. So let's say that there's not an addiction specialist on the team, but that there's a veteran that really needs to get into treatment and is seeking treatment. The case management team is going to assist with that facilitation, making sure that veteran's connected to the appropriate resource, whether it's in the community or in the VA, and then help support them through that process. A big part of case management has nothing to do with HUD-VASH or homeless or not homeless, but overall case management is to empower individuals and help them respect their self-determination in what's most important to them. And again, that's going to come from goal setting. So if somebody has that really big goal of having 50 acres of undeveloped land that they're going to build a house on, we're going to start breaking that down, and maybe that's the piece that person holds on to that helps them keep moving forward, is that goal. For other people, their goal may be to be able to work 3 days a week, and maybe initially they think they're going to work 8 hours a day, but over time they realize that they can only work 4 hours a day. So it's really helping veterans figure out what's best for them and helping them do that. As I've talked about, we want to help individuals connect and root into their communities. So I talk about this a lot as making a house a home, but it's also, I think, about making a neighborhood a community. So it's about finding connections so that you're not just sitting in your apartment watching television, but you know that the library has a book discussion on mystery books every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and you love to meet, you know that veteran likes to read mysteries, so you're helping them get there. Maybe you go with them one time. You know a veteran that really loves animals, but their apartment doesn't allow animals, so you help them learn about opportunities at the local animal shelter that they can volunteer with to go and take dogs for walks or help play with the cats that are there, whatever it is. So helping them really connect into the community beyond just living in their apartment. The case management team is also going to help, as I've said many times, help veterans understand how their actions can impact their tenancy. And then as appropriate, we're going to help facilitate communication with the landlord. So the population that is served in HUD-VASH oftentimes may not have the greatest rental history, may not have the best ability to communicate. So we want to coach and mentor that veteran and help them build the skills to help them communicate with their landlord effectively to address any needs that come up with the apartment. And then the landlord, as I've said many times, we want to see the landlord hold the veteran to their tenancy requirement. We want to see them communicate their concerns with the veteran, and then as appropriate with the case manager or a designated point of contact. We have some medical centers that have said to landlords, hey, let us know if this is happening, but when you let us know, call this number because this is the number that we have somebody monitor 24 hours a day. Or, you know, if you're going to send something to the veteran, could you just CC us so that we can make sure that they got it? And then we want to make sure that landlords understand HUD-VASH is a clinical program and some information is privileged. We're not going to talk with landlords about diagnoses, but we might talk with landlords about if a landlord's getting a complaint that someone is being is screaming out in the middle of the night because they have night terrors, and that's communicated. We're not going to disclose that veteran's diagnosis, but we're going to talk with the landlord to better understand what the problem is, and then we're going to work with the veteran to address it and help them understand how, you know, we know that they haven't wanted to see somebody about that, or we know they haven't wanted to take their medication, but here are some consequences that might be coming, so let's reevaluate that and reexamine that. So I just wanted to check in, Shantira, to see if there's any more questions.
There are a few questions, and I want to make certain that we capture them all. I'm going to scroll right up, but before we move into the questions, I want to thank everyone for their patience today as we navigated through our technical glitch. There is a question I'm looking at from Vicki. She wants to know, how can a nonprofit housing provider who also provides supportive services to homeless veterans access VASH project-based vouchers?
So, Vicki, I think the best way to do that is to start a conversation with your medical center and your housing authority. The housing authority has to award project-based vouchers, and even under HOTMA, they can't just say, oh, you're going to be our project-based HUD-VASH provider. They still have to go through a competitive process, but the medical center also has to support that and see that as a need. So I'm not sure where you're located, but I have my contact information on the next page. So if you're not connected with your housing authority or your medical center, you can reach out to me after the call.
All right, great. The next question comes from Edgar, and Edgar wants to know, do the housing authorities have the ability to convert choice vouchers to project-based based on community needs?
So, yep. So again, that's part of the rollout of HOTMA, is that the housing authorities can convert their tenant-based vouchers to project-based vouchers at any time. That's actually always been an option in the program, but now that's the only way to develop project basing. And again, it has to be a conversation with the medical center and the housing authority, and ideally with the community, to look at what the needs are of the veteran population.
All right. Another question from, let's see, Rick. And Rick wants to know, and I am having problems scrolling up. Let's see. His question is, what about the special needs population living in manufactured homes that are substandard without escapable windows, living in the disaster areas?
So I think you're asking if that makes someone homeless. So again, you would have to look at the definition of homelessness and then look at that human habitation. And human habitation really isn't defined anywhere, but you would want to look for some basic things. I often have talked about on many calls that I interviewed and screened a veteran for HUD-VASH many years ago, and he described his housing to me and to my colleague, and we were like, this person isn't homeless. They're in this cabin, and we talked to their case manager afterwards, and she said he lives in a hunting blind. There's no running water, there's no heat, there's no electricity, and as I said, I'm in Vermont. We were moving into winter quite rapidly, so we had to factor all of that in, and we determined that it was not meant for human habitation. We're able to admit that veteran. But I will tell you, I've looked many times, and there's no clear definition of what human habitation is, so you would want to look at that. I would also recommend that if you're not connected to your continuum of care, that you reach out to them. They may also have some more local information about what they consider. And your housing authority would be able to tell you what the housing quality standards are for a unit to pass any inspection for them to receive a subsidy, and that housing quality standards is actually put out by HUD, and you can Google that document as well.
All right. Looks like we have one final question. Unless other folks want to quickly chat in your questions while we are proceeding with this last one, does the Housing Authority control tenant-based vouchers, and if not, which office does?
So the Housing Authority is issued the vouchers, so I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but so HUD, the Public and Indian Housing Office, is who, within HUD's budget, is going to allocate the vouchers. The vouchers are going to be allocated to the Public Housing Authority, and then the housing authorities are responsible for the issuance of HUD-VASH vouchers, or of vouchers locally. So I think the answer to your question, if I'm understanding it, is yes.
All right. Looks like those are all the questions we have. Let's see. Yep, she says yes, that was it. That was Dondria.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Dondria.
So I just wanted to, I was just going to say my email and phone number are in the slide deck. Please feel free to email me if you think of something afterwards, or if you have other questions that come up, you can also call me. Either one is fine.
All right, perfect. Thank you. There are no additional questions coming up. We are a little bit over the top of the hour. Want to thank our speaker, Jessie, for the wealth of information that she shared with each of us today. Also want to thank everyone on the call for their time, their patience, as well as their participation during the webinar today. Please be on the lookout for an email link that contains a survey to the webinar. That is the way that you let us know if we are bringing the most relevant content to your programs of service and needs. Thank you again, Jessie, as well as everyone on the call today. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.